Generally speaking, our C6 Corvettes are very reliable sports cars. That having been said, one of the most common and fairly expensive problems these cars face is the failure of the stock harmonic balancer. Over time, even on relatively low mileage cars, this outer ring, which is bonded to the inner hub with this rubber elastomer, can start to separate. If this starts to happen and the problem is not identified and repaired, the outer ring can completely separate from that inner hub and either slide backwards where it starts to grind a hole in the engine's timing cover, or slide forward where it becomes a relatively heavy underhood projectile. The first sign of a failing harmonic balancer is typically a chirping sound that's coming from the belt drive when the engine's running. Or sometimes you can actually see the harmonic balancer wobbling if you look down at the crankshaft area while the engine's running. That's obvious, that harmonic balancer is shot. We're going to need to put a new one. Unfortunately, replacing the harmonic balancer is quite a bit of work. If you live in Minnesota near the Twin Cities Metro and yours needs replacing, shoot me an email and maybe we can work something out. If you're thinking about changing your own harmonic balancer on your C6, here's a step-by-step video of how I like to perform this project, so grab a cup of coffee and enjoy. I've got the fenders well protected so they won't accidentally get scratched while I'm working, and I've got a nice bright light focused on the front of the engine so the video should pick up every step nicely so that you can follow along and actually see what I'm doing. Toys4Life. The first step is to remove both front tires. This will give us good access to the tie rod ends that we need to remove from the knuckles in order to be able to slide the steering rack out of the way for access to the vibration damper. Next, remove the negative battery cable from the battery and set it off to the side. Now I will remove the passenger side engine cover, followed by one of the heat shield fasteners, and then move to the driver's side and do the same. Then remove the air intake heat shield. Now I'll go ahead and remove my stock LS7 air intake assembly. The method is similar for removing the LS2 or the LS3 air intake assembly. Next, let's get the radiator hold down bracket out of the way. It is held in place by 2 screws on each side of the radiator. Then lift the steam hose out from the clips and remove the hold down bracket. Now I'm going to slide underneath and remove the anti-sway bar because it's quick and simple to remove, and it frees up quite a bit of real estate underneath the car. There's a nut to remove at each end, and then 2 small bolts hold each bushing clamp to the cradle, and that's it. Plus, now is a good time to inspect your end links for excessive play, and mine turn out to be in good shape. Next, I'm going to remove the cooling fan assembly. It is possible to remove the fan and radiator as one unit, but I prefer to separate them as it is super easy. There are just 2 bolts to remove. Here is the first one. Then we need to disconnect the fan's electrical plug from the harness. And by the way, on the C6s, these plugs are known to melt and fail due to the high amperage draw, but thankfully mine shows no signs of excessive heat, resistance, or deterioration. Now I'll go back up top quick and pop the hoses out from their holders on top of the shroud, and once that's done, I can go back underneath and lift the fan assembly off of its holders. That's these little guys right here. Then I can carefully remove the assembly from underneath the car. Here are the little perches I was talking about on the fan assembly that slide into the grooves on the radiator. There are 4 of them, and here are where the 2 bolts go that secure the fan assembly in place. It's time to get the steering rack out of the way. The first step is critical. Be sure to lock your steering wheel inside the car because we're going to be disconnecting the steering from the steering rack. And if for any reason the steering wheel was to spin while it's disconnected, that could very easily damage or destroy your steering wheel position sensor, and your C6 won't be happy about it. Your active handling won't work, and it's going to cost you a fair bit of money and quite a bit of time to replace it. So be sure to secure your steering wheel. One last thing before starting the rack removal is to remove the main serpentine belt. This is super easy, but be sure to get a good look at how the belt moves around the water pump, alternator, power steering pump, and idler and tensioner pulleys. Shoot a quick video of your own or use this one for reference because it can be a bit tricky to find the correct route if you don't do this often. Let's start by removing the ABS pump support bracket. There are 2 bolts that hold it to the cradle and 2 nuts that hold it to the ABS pump. A ratcheting wrench breaks the nuts loose, and then you can usually finish them by hand, and then go ahead and remove the bolts that go into the cradle. Moving up top, the ABS pump will be hanging without the mount, so I like to rig up a support system so the brake lines don't have to do all of the work. Now I can go back underneath and remove the mounting bracket. When the bracket is removed, I put its bolts back where they go so I cannot lose them or mix them up with other bolts for other components. While I was up top hanging the ABS pump, I took the opportunity to remove the bolt holding the steering shaft to the steering rack, and you can see its head right here. To get at it, use a socket on a long extension with a wobble drive and insert it just ahead of the alternator. Now I can break the bolt loose and then remove it with the electric ratchet. Then by using your hand alone, you should be able to reach in and pull the steering shaft off of the steering rack nub and set it off to the side. This is a good time to make a note of where you have any hydraulic leaks, if any, from your steering rack, and where they are. You can see something's been leaking here, but it's very light because it's a dry, slow buildup of grime. I'm not worried about it. There's nothing dripping, and my reservoir never needs refilling. So I have no problems in my own car reusing this rack. Now let's remove the tie rod to steering knuckle connections. This takes an 18mm wrench to loosen the nut and an Allen head socket to keep the ball joint shaft from spinning. Then, leaving the nut engaged in the threads of the stud several turns, I give it a couple of love taps with a lead hammer, and it usually doesn't take much to break it loose since these knuckles are made of aluminum. Now we can remove the bolts holding the rack to the cradle, and both sides of the bolt take an 18mm. It takes a little feeling and finding the right path, but you can use a combination wrench on the back side and an impact on the front side. Next, I'm going to cut the zip tie holding the power steering line to the rack, and then remove the 2 screws that hold the line to the cradle. To get a little extra clearance for removing the steering rack, I'm going to loosen all 4 of the cradle bolt nuts, moving between each one and loosening each one. A little at a time until they are engaged, but plenty of bolt threads are still showing. Then I pry down on the cradle and insert a spacer between the cradle and the C6's frame, which provides more room for manipulating the steering rack. I've lifted the rack out of its mounting slots and I've started sliding the whole assembly towards the passenger side. Now I have better clearance to get in with an 18mm line wrench and remove the 2 upper power steering lines from the rack. But first I clean them thoroughly with solvent, a brush, and compressed air, to minimize the chance of any debris getting into the rack when the lines are removed. Dropping the cradle allows you to move the rack forward a bit and rotate it slightly, giving you better access to the power steering lines. Using an 18mm line wrench, go ahead and break the first power steering line nut loose where it connects to the rack, and you should be able to wiggle the line with one hand while unscrewing the nut with the other. Once off, you'll definitely lose some power steering fluid, so have a drain pan on standby. Remove the second line just like you did the first one, and be sure to label them so you don't get them mixed up when the time comes to put them back together. Also be sure to plug both holes in the steering rack to prevent any debris from getting inside. Now carefully rotate the rack and start its journey further towards the passenger side, being careful not to damage the accordion-style dust boots. Now carefully take your time and manipulate the rack to the passenger side, far enough so you can get the driver's side tie rod end inside the engine bay side of the cradle, and then pull it out and down, and now you can carefully slide the rack out by moving it back to the driver's side and down and out. Now you can pat yourself on the back. The steering rack has been successfully liberated. Time to unload the air conditioning belt tensioner and remove the air conditioning belt, and since I have both belts handy, let's give them a quick inspection. They both look to be in good shape to me, so they're getting reused. Now it's time to remove the 24mm bolt holding the vibration damper on, and if it was installed correctly, it's on pretty tight. To remove it, you can either use a 1/2-inch drive impact gun if yours is powerful enough, or you can use a long breaker bar. If you do use a breaker bar, you're going to need to hold on to the damper with something like this holding tool from Summit Racing, or you'll need to lock the flywheel with a locking tool like this one to prevent the crankshaft from turning. I typically use an impact gun to remove the bolt, but I'll go ahead and demonstrate the breaker bar with damper holder tool method. As you can see, it's tight, but it's no match for a decent long 1/2-inch drive breaker bar, and once it's loose, you should be able to remove it by hand. Now we need to break out the puller tool to remove the damper from the crankshaft. After adding a drop or two of oil to each end of the rod, the tool is set up like so onto the Harmonic Balancer. Then I use a ratchet to tighten the bolt, which will remove the damper from the crankshaft snout. This one looks to be a GM damper to me, and it looks too good to be original. However, GM dampers do not have the best reputation for lasting a long time, so it's going to get replaced. Time to check on all of the idler and tensioner pulleys. I simply spin each one and feel if it's smooth as it should be or if it's a little rough. At the same time, I listen carefully and they should all be very quiet. Finally, I give each one a tug and a twist and see if any of them are showing any signs of looseness or play in their bearings. Fortunately, mine all easily passed the tests, and so I'll be reusing them. Time to install the vibration damper. The PowerBond Premium Replacement damper has a long reputation on the forums as being significantly better than stock, and I've been running this same damper on the supercharged C5 for about 7 years with no issues. So with that in mind, the C6 is getting one as well. One thing to note is that the stock GM dampers use a friction shim behind the damper, and this part is not required for the PowerBond, so keep that in mind. Then behind the scenes, I've carefully heated the damper in our kitchen oven to about 130 degrees to make it a bit easier to slide on. Now I quickly set the new damper in place, and then using a vibration damper installer tool, I thread it deeply into the crankshaft, and now I can safely pull the damper onto the crankshaft about 90% of the way or so. Never ever try to install the vibration damper using the stock bolt. I checked and the damper is not quite far enough on, so I've installed the holding tool and I give it a few more turns to get it to where the crank snout is only recessed inside the damper by about 1/4 inch or so. Now I can use the old bolt to fully seat the damper onto the crankshaft by torquing it down to 240 pound-feet. 240 pound-feet is no joke, so I use a 2-foot long torque wrench to make it easier, and you may want to do so as well. Unless, of course, you're this guy. Now I can zip off the old bolt, and to do that quickly, I use my mid-range DeWalt 1/2-inch impact gun, which is absolutely perfect for this and for lug nuts as well. If you're going to be pinning your vibration dampener to the crankshaft, now would be the ideal time to do that. For those that are not familiar with it, pinning the dampener to the crankshaft is the practice of drilling a hole between the dampener and the crankshaft, and then a pin is inserted into that hole, and this helps provide additional assurance that the dampener will not spin on the crankshaft, which is especially important for engines that'll be going into performance applications. Step 1 is to bolt your pinning fixture tool to the front of the crankshaft and snug it down. I've included a link to this tool in the description below. Next, I like to put a drop of oil on the tip of the drill bit and then start the drilling process. Be sure to have your drill on low speed and then provide firm and even pressure in order to avoid breaking the drill bit off in the hole. Then every couple of minutes, remove the drill, clean the shavings, and remove the fixture so you can measure the depth of your hole. Then reinstall the fixture and drill for another minute or so and repeat the process. It usually takes me 3 or 4 cycles to get the hole to the depth I am looking for, which allows the pin to end up slightly recessed past the face of the crankshaft towards the engine. When you're certain the depth is to where you want it, clean everything one last time with a magnet, followed by compressed air, and then tap the pin into place. Next step is to grab a new GM vibration damper bolt, and I put a little grease on the shoulder of the bolt to reduce friction while tightening, and several drops of blue Loctite on the threads to help keep it from backing out. I have used ARP bolts as well, but I prefer the GM bolt because I like its torque to yield design for this purpose, as I feel it provides a better stretch, and if that is true, then it should be less likely to ever come loose. Now the new bolt is torqued down to a very light and easy 37 pound-feet of torque, and it is critical not to go over 37 pound-feet of torque at this time, so be careful and get this correct. Now the bolt head is marked carefully, and the final step is to rotate it another 140 degrees to accurately stretch the bolt the proper amount. This does take quite a bit of force, so use at least a 2-foot long breaker bar here. Here is the bolt head in its final position, which is pretty close to being right on the money. And now, of course, it makes sense to slide the AC belt on while we're down here. The rack is going in next, but it is a little grimy, so I'm going to spend a few minutes with some degreaser, a brush, and a few rags to make it a little more presentable. Now I can start the super fun part of installing the steering rack back into the C6. I did take a quick look at the video footage from part 2 where I removed the rack to refresh my memory a bit as to the routing of the rack through the wires and hoses, and that is helpful, but I'm not going to lie. I always feel like the racks, they kick and they scream a little bit while they're being put back in, so make sure you do this part when you're feeling patient and energetic. Make sure you stop short of getting the rack 100% ready to bolt up to the cradle, as it is much easier to screw the 2 power steering hoses back into the rack with it sitting about 6 inches or so towards the passenger side, and rotate it just a bit to allow access to be able to tighten the hose ends with a line wrench. Done this way, you can get the 18mm line wrench on the fittings and your hand in there to tighten them from the wheel well side. Now we can slide the rack back towards the driver's side and into its mounts, and it may take a little poking and prying, and when it's all lined up, I insert the 2 bolts that hold the rack to the cradle and torque them to 74 pound-feet. Now I can tighten the 2 small bolts that hold one of the power steering lines to the cradle and zip tie the other one to the rack, which I don't recall as being factory. However, it's how I found mine when I took it apart, and it seemed to work just fine. Next, I'm going to toss the main serpentine belt on, as it might just be a little bit easier to do from underneath since the radiator and fan are still out of the way. If you get confused, just Google C6 belt diagram and an image will pop up that'll make it crystal clear. The EBCM support bracket is next. I slide it in from up high and work my way down. Then I tighten the 2 EBCM nuts up first that are up high. Then I insert the 2 bolts that hold the bracket to the cradle and torque them down to only 20 pound-feet. Now let's get the cradle bolts tightened back up. So with a pry bar, I remove the 2 spacers that I installed. Then, using a 1/2-inch drive ratchet, I tighten the bolts up until snug. Then I finish them off with a torque wrench, bringing each of them to 81 pound-feet. Now I can put the fan back in. I have the hoses being held towards the engine with a couple of bungee cords, so they're out of the way, and I drop the fan down in where the assembly sits on its 4 little perches. So I just need to get the slots lined up with the grooves from the top, then I'll look from underneath to make sure the bottom slots are lined up as well, and they are. Now I can put a bolt in the bottom one, and up top as well to hold the fan assembly in place. Then I can clip the upper hoses into their spot to tidy them up along the radiator and reconnect the steam hose as well. It's pretty straightforward. Just make sure it's sitting flat over the radiator so the bolts don't have to tug very hard on the plastic when tightening it to the frame rails. Then insert the hose into the built-in clips and tighten the screws. Now let's toss the air filter and mass airflow sensor assembly back in. I've done this about 1,000,000 times, making a series of videos while testing the stock LS2 air intake assembly, and when I did the conversion to the factory LS7 air intake, so yours will likely look different than mine. Next, I'm going to reattach the steering shaft to the steering rack, and it might take a little wiggling and jiggling, but take your time and it'll usually slide right back on. Make sure you have the coupler inserted to allow for the bolt to pass through the groove in the rack's input shaft. Then absolutely use some Loctite and torque the bolt down using a torque wrench to the GM spec for your particular year C6. Now let's reattach the tie rod ends to the knuckles. I like to clean the ball joint and the hole first, then we need to follow a 3-step process. For my 2006 C6, first the nut is torqued down to exactly 15 pound-feet. Then, holding the stud, rotate the nut an additional 160 degrees, and finally check it with a torque wrench set to 32 pound-feet, and it shouldn't move at all before clicking. We lost some power steering fluid while the steering rack was out, but no worries. It was probably a little old anyway, and some fresh fluid will be good for it. The only thing we have left is to reinstall the anti-sway bar. I marked the driver's side with duct tape, as it's not always obvious which way the bar goes when it comes time for reinstallation. And finish it off by bolting the end links to the lower control arms, and you're done. If this video helped you in any way, click that thumbs up so YouTube knows to share it with the Corvette community. Consider subscribing so you don't miss the next Toys4Life video, and thanks for watching.